Right. Welcome back to lecture 15 of the CBD Cal. Just want to go over some quick announcements. Homework 3 is almost ready, should be released tomorrow or on Friday. We are going to be much stricter with the extensions of homework 3 because people just sort of abuse them for homework 2. Just want to give a heads up about that. Quiz 7 will be released tomorrow, hopefully. Really sorry for the delays. We will extend the due date for that quiz to sort of account for that. And yeah.
All right, so today we're going to be going over advanced object detection and segmentation, how we can use transformer models that are a little more powerful and a little more computationally efficient to hopefully get better results in object detection. We're also going to be kind of taking a survey of the field as a whole of computer vision and seeing what is being prioritized in these models and why, in terms of generalizability and being able to classify and do operations on content that models haven't seen before. So kind of going into philosophically, what do we want out of machine learning models in the future and how can we take steps towards that direction? This is a brief agenda of what we're going to be talking about. We're going to start off with CNNs, move on to a brief overview of the transformer, compare vision transformers to CNNs, talk about the Swin transformer, which is a step in the right direction, kind of take a step back, and then briefly talk about segmentation, specifically the segment anything model. The other two aren't going to be as relevant for us today. So the tool suits the task. We started this course with talking about what a CNN is. This was immediately after our initial deep learning lectures. We know that a kernel goes over an image, it moves a certain stride length, and it creates a convolution, sharing information across the image. If one filter is able to learn something about an image, this is shared across the image and applied to every patch in the image, right? CNNs by design start by detecting edges and general contours, and they get more specific as you move on to further layers and deeper into the network. This should all be kind of a review. On the right is a diagram, kind of showing how this works. And towards the end of the learning process, we understand that CNNs are able to gain intuition for specific features. We've talked about why these are important, why these are a cornerstone of these, and you guys have implemented them in your homeworks as well. Some benefits of CNNs and some of their key characteristics are translational equivariance and a 2D neighborhood structure, right? We know from before that CNNs traditionally are used for 2D images and image processing in their most basic form. And what translational equivariance means is that as we move an input, our output is also moved. CNNs are able to account for this in their process. And a large part of this can be attributed to how they work. We are applying the same filter across an image. So if our area of interest changes, our output is also going to change because now we're applying this filter to a different part of the image. CNNs respect locality. They don't start by comparing two opposite edges of an image, but they start with pixels that are closer together. And they apply this to the entirety of the image. CNNs are translational equivariant, like our eyes. We briefly talked about this before, but if something is moved in the way that we see it, we're still able to see what it is, but we also understand that it's in a different part of our view field. And that's what a CNN is trying to capture. CNNs have shown a propensity for textural bias over shape. There's a study that asserts that CNNs can still classify perfectly given shape augmentation while texture is constant. Implicitly, this is pretty interesting, showing that CNNs are biased towards certain things like texture, for example. Another paper supports this, showing that CNNs are texture biased and their performance can be improved by increasing shape bias. We can see that stylistically, the image is changed. These are two different images, but the content image is then styled like our style image. And we can show that CNNs are biased towards images that are the same texture. So this might incorrectly classify as the style image as opposed to the content. because it prioritizes these implicit textures. This is from the paper that shows that CNNs are texture biased. You take a texture image, an elephant hide, and we take a content image of a cat. And if we apply the image of the elephant texture to the cat, it's incorrectly classified as an elephant with 64% kind of confidence. Introducing the transformer, and we kind of talked about this transition later, but we looked at this primarily in the context of NLP, and then we kind of moved it to vision transformers. Self-attention is a way, as we learned, to tie things together in a sentence, or more generally, to tie tokens to each other, right? We perform self-attention within a sequence, so we can figure out what's more important. If you guys recall the QKV updates, attention lets us focus on certain parts of the input while we're generating the output, so that implicitly we're able to kind of learn more important parts of our input sequence. And self-attention lets us do that within a sequence. For example, in this example on the right, I poured the water from the bottle into the cup until it was full. In this case, it is referring to the cup. I poured water from the bottle into the cup until it was empty. The only thing changed was full versus empty, but our entire subject changed from a cup to a bottle. So understanding this and performing self-attention might hint to things like the last word is extremely important because it's changing the overall subject of our sentence. And a quick refresher, we talked about how attention is calculated with a query key and value system, where we take kind of the dot products, we apply a softmax, and we update our values accordingly to kind of come up with a representative output. The reason that I wanted to revisit CNNs as well as transformers is because these are the building blocks of the modern computer vision systems that are being used today. And we're going to be talking about how their benefits and their drawbacks have really influenced the future of this field. CNNs obviously have their benefits and they have their drawbacks. CNNs are able to work like our eyes do. They're able to share features. They're able to take into account locality, and transformers are able to kind of do all of these things really well, right? They're able to take into account long sequence lengths. They're able to do self-attention, figure out what parts of the image are important. And these NLP-based transformers can also be applied to vision tasks through vision transformers. Now, what if the tool could suit multiple tasks, right? We talked about how transformers were initially used for NLP tasks for taking into account these long sequence lengths. And we talked about how CNNs are used for image tasks to be able to capture these localities, these dependencies, and apply it to an image. Now, what if the tool suits multiple tasks? Introducing the vision transformer. We want to deviate very little from the NLP transformer architecture, and this breaks images into flattened patches of 16 by 16 pixels. So we're taking transformers that were primarily used for NLP, we're taking CNNs that were primarily used for images, and we're trying to kind of mix these two modalities together by applying transformers to a new mode of images. We're now breaking the image into patches, and we're treating each patch as a token, or the representation that our word was before. By generating an embedding of each token via a linear projection, we're able to feed it into a transformer architecture that we previously used for NLP tasks. On the right is kind of a takeaway from the Vision Transformer paper of the architecture. And as you can see, on the bottom, instead of passing in like word embeddings, we're passing in patches of images. We're applying a linear projection to get these tokens. And now we're able to pass it into the model as if it were kind of like a word token. Ultimately, the takeaway from transformers is that it doesn't care about what the token is. So by generalizing what this token represents, we're able to use the same architecture for multiple tasks. The transformer encoder is then passed into an MLP head for a final classification across various classes. We also briefly talked during the transformer lecture about position embeddings that allow us to understand positionality in our embeddings. So that instead of passing them in as a jumbled sequence, we understand that some things might want to come before others. And that's another thing that our model can learn. Position information in VITs are learned by the model. And at the end, we talked about this classification head, MLP, predicts the class. Other NLP transformer-esque components like residuals, layer norm, multi-head attention, if you guys remember this diagram on the right, are maintained, where we do kind of like a normalization. If we have multi-heads, we're repeating this process across multiple heads with different QKVs to kind of get a breadth of information and again, make this more generalizable. This is also a snapshot from the VIT paper where we're able to see attention is placed on different kind of foreground elements of the image. And this is something that is super cool because that's something we care about, right? We care about what the subject of an image is, and self-attention is able to make that happen. Comparing vision transformers to CNNs now, we've tried this cross-modality thing where we took transformers that are used for NLP and we applied them to vision tasks. VIT's self-attention layers are global, and that means that we're comparing kind of like every token to every other token during this self-attention process. And to a transformer, an embedding is just an embedding. It doesn't matter whether it's an image or a word when it's passed into the model at this point. This reduces inductive bias in the model compared to CNNs, and it ties into generalizing assumptions based off training data into a model of a domain. Now, what that means is that instead of being specific to certain types of images or specific to images in general, we've successfully come up with an architecture that can be used across modalities and for a variety of tasks. By making models that are more generalizable to various input data and various classes, we're getting closer and closer to a future where machine learning can be applied to various problems without making bespoke architectures for these modalities. Occam's razor states that if two models explain the training data equally well, the simpler model is preferred as a generalization. This is kind of Occam's razor in the view of machine learning. But what it's trying to do is explain the tenets of parsimony, right? Which is that we want the simplest model possible to explain the most amount of things possible, because simplicity is what allows us to capture the most amount of information, right? We're trying to capture the most amount of information with the least amount of, I guess, work. On smaller data sets, we see that CNNs outperform transformers. Transformers shine when a lot of data is present because we're making use of being able to process these long sequence lengths, as opposed to CNNs where we'd have to take every image kind of in a silo. And while we are sharing features, transformers are able to do so on a much larger and computationally efficient scale. There's an assertion that VITs model human insight more than CNNs. They prioritize shape bias by default, right? When we see things, we immediately think about how shapes relate to each other, the shape of humans, the shape of chairs, the shape of cups. And texture is kind of an afterthought, right? We've seen chairs that are fuzzy. We've seen chairs that are wooden, but we know that those are both chairs. CNNs, on the other hand, might confuse a fuzzy chair for a fuzzy cat, just because of their propensity for textural bias, because maybe it's present in earlier layers or iterations of the CNN. This could be because of reduced inductive bias, right? Or this ability to kind of generalize across different kinds of input images and being used for multiple different kinds of tasks. I think this is very important to keep in mind because really this is what machine learning is, machine learning's future is based in. Can we create models that are able to understand a variety of things without having to fine-tune these models or without having to change our architecture around every time we want to apply machine learning to a different task? Now, we can consider this in the lens of robustness against adversarial attacks. Because VITs prioritize a shape propensity over a textural understanding, they seem naturally robust to visual distortions, right? Even the human eye isn't infallible. One of these is a cat and one of these is a dog, and it's really hard to tell which one is which. I think on the left is a cat and on the right is a dog, but they look really similar. The only differences are like subtle differences in the nose and maybe the eyes and the bottom. VIT limitations are evident in other fields of computer vision in terms of image restoration or semantic segmentation. And we'll talk about that a little bit. Patches are passed in and processed one at a time, so border information can be lost. What's cool about CNNs is that Again, they respect locality, and we're taking that into account as we come up with our filters and we move them across our image. VITs are passed in as a sequence. Fine-grained pixel analysis within a patch is weak. Because we're breaking these into small patches, any information that we want to figure out that's contained within a patch is being lost, right? If our patch is 16 by 16, and we'll talk about this, then we are limiting ourselves to only understanding in a 16 by 16 pixel like kind of width. We can understand relationships between 16 by 16 patches, but we can't understand any information within a 16 by 16 patch, which makes it really bad for tasks like semantic segmentation. We can see at the bottom a classic example of robustness where we have a correct classification. If we input some noise into an image, this is incorrectly classified as a given. And even though this might not be visually distorting the image, to any classifier that might prioritize things implicitly, the final kind of result is going to be changed. VIT is not always lit. The problem, and we kind of mentioned this earlier, but by breaking an image into 16 by 16 patches, then creating patch vectors with a linear projection, then combining vectors with positional embeddings, passing it into a transformer, kind of going with the transformer architecture afterwards, this could lead to some problems. But this is a visualization of the vision transformer. We have an image, we break it into patches, pass those patches into a projection, we generate our tokens, combine them with positional embeddings. And at this point, we can just use like kind of a vanilla transformer architecture coupled with a classification head to spit out our final classification. This leads to a little bit of a problem, right? If we have a 256 by 256 pixel image that results in 16, and we're using, 16 by 16 patches, that results in 256 image tokens, right? If we break this into 16 by 16 patches, that's how many tokens we end up generating. Now, if we have a 1920 by 1920 pixel image, and we use these 16 by 16 patches, we have a couple more image tokens, right? We've expanded this significantly. And that's all right if we're doing tasks like trying to find what the general gist of an image is, right? What is this an image of? Well, we can classify this as a balloon. And 16 by 16 patches are fine for tasks like that, where we're trying to get a grander sense of what an image is about. But for tasks on the right, where we're trying to identify in this balloon, what are these little things? These are people, right? This is a semantic segmentation task where we want to label these pixels as people. And 16 by 16 patches are way too big for the problem that we're trying to do. We can see here that the extraction of patches is a problem specific to images and not texts, right? For bigger images, the number of tokens will grow very quickly on the order of n to the 4, which is okay for bigger GPUs and if our task only wants these 16 by 16 patches. For image classification, this is fine. We're associating one label with one image. But for semantic segmentation and fine-grained tasks, we can't see anything smaller than these 16 by 16 patches. Ideally, something that we can do is tokenize each pixel, but this results in extremely long sequence lengths being passed into the transformer, right? For a 1920 pixel by 1080 pixel, an HD image, we get 2 million plus tokens if we treat each of these as its own token. And for 4K images, we have 8 million plus image tokens. This becomes extremely computationally inefficient, especially the process of calculating self-attention. How can we solve this? And what are ways that we can potentially reduce the size of our patches while keeping into account the things that make a transformer architecture so powerful? The rise of the shifted window. The authors introduced something called the shifted window transformer, which was introduced in mid-2021, where we can use non-overlapping windows to perform self-attention within groups. This develops a hierarchical feature map that yields an improved global representation of an image. We can see that we have linear complexity with respect to image size, which we'll talk about, and this flexibility allows it to excel at a variety of computer vision tasks: image classification, object detection, semantic segmentation. And this was something that was benchmarked against vision transformers and other kinds of transformers, and it was proven that this did outperform them by a decent margin. And there are some caveats with that, but we'll talk about that when we take a step back. In the bottom right, we can get a sense of generally what the string transformer tries to do. A vision transformer keeps the image patch size the same, right? We have 16 by 16 patches, and we've broken an image into one specific kind of segmentation. This is continued across the network until we finally spit out a classification after our transformer architecture has done its due diligence. What a swing transformer tries to do is take smaller patches of, for example, 4 by 4 pixels, but have more patches. Then intelligently try to merge these patches together so that in later layers and later iterations of the network, we reduce our patches to have a smaller number of patches, but with more, a smaller number of windows, but with more information contained in them. So we've reduced the number of the number of patches by combining patches. So instead of 4 by 4 patches, here we have 8 by 8 patches, and we result in 16 by 16 patches as we double the size of each patch every iteration of the swing transformer. This is going to become more clear as we walk through an example and talk about this patch merging process. But generally, you can imagine a swing transformer as taking more fine-grained patches in the beginning of training and then increasing the size of these patches later and later in the network. As we continue the training process. The idea is that this is more computationally efficient, and we're also able to do better in tasks that require fine-grained detail. An example is this Swin transformer over here, which is the Swin large patch for Windows 7, 224, 22K to 1K. That's a mouthful. But we're going to explain kind of what this means in the context of a Swin transformer, and hopefully this gives some perspective as to how this works. The premise of this is that we start with smaller patches in earlier layers and then merge them into bigger patches in later stages of training. C is the capacity of the model, or the size of the token embeddings when the image patches are initially converted to a 1D sequence. So we have our initial patches that we create of the image, and we're converting each of these into a token that can be passed into our transformer model and perform self-attention between, right? For BERT, for example, we know that we can have a 768 length embedding, and that represents our C for a BERT-based model. C is, like I mentioned, the size of the token embeddings when the image patches are initially converted. So the bigger C is, the more kind of information you're containing. The Swin Tiny model has a C of 96 and large a C of 192. 224 represents the input image size of 224 by 224 by 3 for a 3-channel image, which is what this 224 is. Swin large represents that we're using a C of 192, or that's the size of our embeddings. We can see on the right kind of the general sense of how a transformer architecture might work. Where we have these embeddings, we perform self-attention. This results in the same number of tokens, and then we perform a feed-forward neural network. We pass them through to kind of introduce nonlinearities, and then we result in tokens that we can use for our final classification. Looking on the left, we see that we try to undergo a linear transformation to convert to a C-dimensional vector. And then we want to partition the image in a non-overlapping way. And that's what M represents. Windows 7 represents how many windows we want in our image. So we're splitting our initial image into 7 distinct windows, each window having specific number of patches that are a certain pixel width. And this is going to be kind of visualized in the next couple of slides, so hopefully that makes a little more sense. But we'll talk about the importance of M and especially how that relates to the stopping condition of a swing transformer. 22K to 1K just means that the model was trained on ImageNet 22K and then fine-tuned on ImageNet 1K. This is straight from the swing transformer paper, but we can see that we have a layer norm similar to our kind of vanilla transformer architecture. We pass it into a windowed multi kind of self-attention block, and then from there another layer norm, and then an MLP, right, where we have an input and output. We've talked about this kind of briefly before, but transformers often use the GELU activation function, which I think is the Gaussian linear activation function. And so the goal is to kind of see how this architecture corresponds to this new modality that we're trying to explore. So for the first block, windowed MSA, attention is performed within each window, where M is the number of patches the attention spans. So in this case, M equals 2, because we want to perform self-attention instead of between, if we're representing all patches, we only perform self-attention between these two patches. The idea is that here, if N is our total number of patch vectors, and we're going to eventually produce N vectors, we're now only computing self-attention within an M number of patches. The benefit of this is that instead of self-attention being an N squared operation, where we're computing with regards to every other patch that we have in our sequence, we're only computing self-attention within a limited number of windows called N. So now our time complexity is on the order of O M times N instead of N squared, right? So now we're computing a smaller number of dot products within each window. And since the number of patches in each window is fixed, complexity becomes linear to image size. So as we increase the size of our image and we generate more tokens, now complexity, instead of being a squared factor, is linear with regards to increases in our image size, not quadratic as it is for vision transformers. Stage 1 is done, right? We've kind of talked about what windowed MSA is. And next, we want to go into what shifted windowed MSA is, which is really the crux of the shifted window transformer. We're trying to start off with really small patches and a higher number of windows, then combine patches and reduce the number of windows that we have, to hopefully be able to generalize as we move on to further layers of our network. Moving on to the shifted window, this is where the patch merging process comes into play. The author's example takes M equals 4 windows and a small image that can be broken into 8 by 8 patches, which is 64 total patches in an image. So we can see here, this is our total image. We have 8 by 8 patches, each patch being a small pixel width. This results in 4 windows. This was also specified by our author. So we have 4 total windows with 64 total patches, right? This results in 16 patches in a single window, and that's something we're going to take into account during the merging process. What layer 1+1 kind of hints at is the first step in this merging process. We want to perform self-attention within each of these windows, and on the right we can see that the red highlighting is the window that we want to perform attention in, and the gray highlighting is a singular patch. Once attention is finished within these windows, we want to start the merging process, which concatenates features of each group of 2 by 2 neighboring patches and creates new patch borders. We can kind of walk through this process. As you can see here, we have our initial image, and in red here, an initial patch. The first step is to expand this patch by 2 pixels each. So we are essentially padding our image and increasing this window in a 2 by 2 frame. If we do this for each one of our patches, we come up with intersections where the dotted lines are the intersections between our new windows. And these generate our new patch borders post-merge. There are still 4 patches, as you can see here, generally, but now they extend kind of like a radius of 2 pixels outside of the initial patch length. And these intersections are what represent our new patch borders, as you can see over here. So now we've gone from 4 patches to 9 patches, where 4 windows to 9 windows, where each one of these windows has a different number of patches. How can we now combine these to be something relevant to the next step of our shifted window MSA process? We want to keep the edges of the new windows that intersect the image post-padding, and we want to concatenate the 2 by 2 features by performing a 2 by 2 merging of patches. So every 2 by 2 patch over here gets merged into one patch, where we started off with kind of 4 patches here. This has been merged into one patch. Every 2 by 2 section has been merged into one patch. So we've essentially gone from 64 total patches, 8 by 8, to 16, which is now a 4 by 4. And that's the premise behind the Swin transformer. As we move forward in layers, we're having each dimension, which reduces our number of patches by a factor of 4. So we've gone from 64 total patches in our image to 16 total patches. Essentially, what we've done is we started with really tiny patches, for example, 4 pixel by 4 pixel patches, and now we've grown to 8 pixel by 8 pixel patches, and next 16 by 16 pixel patches until we match a vision transformer. In this way, we're able to start off with really fine-tuned detail, but without sacrificing computational efficiency, grow our patch size into what our vision transformer would start off with. So we don't lose out on information. We run it through a linear layer to scale the dimension to 2C, and essentially what we've done is reduce the number of patches to 1/4 of the original. The key here is that we're scaling our C along with reducing the size reducing the total number of patches. So as we reduce the number of patches, we increase the information contained in every patch. So every time we merge these 2x2 patches, we double the embedding size of each token during the patch merging stage. So our C changes as we go through our network. And that intuitively kind of makes sense, right? We're combining patches, so we're increasing the number of information, the amount of information contained in every patch. And we want that to reflect in C, or our embedding size. I'm going to pause for a quick second and ask if there are any glaring questions about this. Okay, hopefully this makes sense. This is the most important part of the Swin transformer, right? The first part, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
So when we merge the patches together to make a larger patch, are we losing a lot of the detail when we do that?
We are losing detail, yeah. The idea is that in earlier layers, we're able to take fine-grained detail into account, and that will propagate through our network, but we are merging patches to get a more broad sense of how things work together.
So are we doing maybe I'm using the wrong words for it, but is it looking at a maximum of the patch, or is it just not when we have a kernel run over an image and it does the max of the
yeah.
Is it like that, or is it that, or is it something completely different?
So you can think of it the operation as self-attention instead of just the maximum.
Okay.
So we're computing self-attention within each patch, or between patches in a specific window, right? And as we increase the size of these windows, for example, this has 4 patches, this has just one patch post-merge. We're now computing self-attention between patches that previously were not computed between. So if you can think of this as a CNN kind of moving across, we're now computing self-attention within things that haven't been seen before. So we're introducing new information every time we merge into new patches. So if you think of it, that's a great question, as parallel to a CNN. Now we're using, instead of a kernel moving over our image, self-attention is being computed across our image.
Okay, so then as the patch gets bigger, the self-attention for the previous ones feed into a new self-attention, the newer bigger one?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. That's a great question. And we're keeping this information by doubling the embedding size of each token as we increase the patches. So we don't lose out on information as we're increasing our patch size. All right, this is a quick example. This corresponds to our initial example of the Swin with 7x7 windows. So 7x7 windows means we have 49 patches per window, and 8x8 or 64 windows total, encoded in C equals 192 dimensions. So this is just kind of walking through the initial example that we had, as opposed to the previous example, which was the author's example from the paper. So we start off with 64 windows, each with 7x7 patches, which is a total of 3,136 patches in our entire image. After the merging process, we reduce the number of patches by 1/4, right? Because we're combining every 2x2 set of patches into one patch. So we reduce from 56 by 56 to 28 by 28, where we're halving each dimension, right? Intuitively, this kind of makes sense. We have 8 by 8 windows, and there should be 7 by 7 patches in each window. Excuse me for the typo. But that results in the number of patches being reduced by a factor of 4. During this process, though, we're also doubling the encodings. So we start off with 192 for C, but afterwards we increase to a size of 384. That is the end of our first merging process. And as you can see on the right, this intuitively, hopefully this image makes a little bit more sense. For VITs, we keep the 16 by 16 patches throughout, but in our swing transformer, we start with 4 by 4 size patches, or much finer grain than the VIT patch. And we start off with 4 by 4 windows, but then we move to 2 by 2 windows, and post-merge, we now have 8 by 8 pixel patches. Post-merge again, now we have a single window that is 16 by 16 patches. So we've matched the vision transformer. I'll pause here for a quick second in case there are any other questions, but I think this visual hopefully makes a decent amount of sense. Okay. Stages 3 and 4 are repeated, or stages 3 and 4 are when the process is repeated until the image has been broken into 49 total tokens, each of 1536 embeddings. So if you keep doubling, you'll eventually hit 1536 embeddings. And the reason that M is important is because not only does it dictate how many patches are in each window, as well as like the total number of windows, but it also determines our stopping condition. We want to stop when the total number of windows is equal to our initial number of patches per window. So if we initially start off with an 8 by 8 kind of, if there's chalk, we start off with like some 8 by 8 thing where we have some 8 by 8. Each one of these is 7 by 7. This goes from 8 by 8 to then being reduced as our patches are merged to maybe like 4 by 4 to like 2 by 2, but the number of windows goes down quite a bit, right? Where we start off with 64 windows, and we reduce the number of these by a factor of 2 every time. We want to end when we have 7 windows. So instead of 8 by 8, we end when we hit 7 by 7. And that was also the size of our initial number of kind of patches per window, if that makes sense. So this not only determines our patches per window, but also our stopping condition for the VIT. You can kind of see that here, right? Here we have 4 by 4 pixels, and we have 4 by 4 patches, or 4 by 4 windows, sorry. And we end when we have a 4 by 4 like total grid here, where every patch results in kind of that 4 by 4 shape in our image. Hopefully that makes a little sense. Yeah.
Sorry. Clarify the distinction between a patch and a window.
Yes.
Step or
Yeah, sure. So we can see here that there are 16 total windows. So everything that's outlined in red is a window. Everything that's outlined in gray is a patch. So each window here is a 4 by 4 of patches. So each of these has 16 patches. And when we move to the 8 by 8 step, we reduce the number of windows from 16 to 4. So we reduce the number of windows by a factor of 4. And we've increased our patch size, but decreased our number of patches. So instead of each patch containing a small amount of information, we've increased the amount of information that each patch contains. Does that make sense?
So is each patch increasing in dimensionality as
Exactly. So we're starting with 4 by 4 pixel patches, then increasing that to 8 by 8 pixel patches by merging.
Okay, so sorry, so like you have, let's say each pixel is, I don't know, R3, right? Then in the second layer they R6?
Yeah.
Okay.
This represents, instead of thinking each pixel is that, our embedding size after passing it in through a linear projection, that size is being increased. So it's not just necessarily the dimensionality of the pixel, like you would think of it as like a CNN, but rather like with our positional embeddings and everything else, in our transformer architecture, our input to the transformer architecture is what is doubling in size, not necessarily the like pixel value itself. All right, so the last component is an average pooling layer followed by a norm. The image is now one representation, and then a classic classification head converts our final amount of embeddings to the right class. Taking a step back, swing transformers manipulate windows so that attention is performed on subsets at a time, but cross attention happens between regions as windows move. And that's what I was talking about a little bit before. As windows shift together, cross attention implicitly happens through the process of just self-attention with changing windows, which is super cool. But that begs the question, are we hurting some of the things that make transformers what they are? In the question of reintroducing inductive bias, studies were done to evaluate swing transformers against adversarial attacks. Do these do worse than VITs? Do they do worse than CNNs? The study proved that they perform well in regards to corruption robustness, and that swing models have a shape bias far lower than VIT, right? So we've kind of gone a little bit backwards. Vision transformers had a very high shape bias, just like humans, but swing transformers have a lower shape bias. And because of that, they are more generalizable, but potentially we're sacrificing what makes a transformer a transformer. So this is a little bit of a trade-off. I think this is a mostly positive thing because of the same argument that we talked about earlier, which is that using the simplest model that is the most generalizable is the most important for the future of ML. However, we know that swing models maybe don't fall prey to the same issues that CNNs do by having a lower shape bias. For example, like being weak against adversarial attacks. Are we getting closer and closer to the Goldilocks of shape and texture bias, where ideally we're not biased towards either of these things, but we don't trade off accuracy in our network by things like adversarial attacks or texture swaps, right? The beauty of transformers is in their genericness. And this is seen simply by understanding that they can be used for NLP and vision tasks. They can capture patterns accurately, no matter the data, domain, use case. More data means more performance, right? We saw this earlier where VITs outperform CNNs with much more data. And VITs clearly show visible improvements up to 64 layers, whereas CNNs we see kind of tap out a little earlier on. Swing is scalable. We know that. It introduces linear time complexity because you're only performing attention within each window. And swing, because of that, is a lot more computationally efficient, especially given the fact that we're able to get finer grain detail in our image. There are some ways that we can make transformers get better, but quick food for thought. Somebody said specialization is for insects. We want to be generalized. We don't want just one tool to suit one task. We want that second premise of one tool for multiple tasks. And Swin hopefully pushes the boundary towards that being the case. And transformers in general are a step in the right direction. What are the benefits and drawbacks of having a model that can take in any kind of data, process it, understand patterns, similar to what our human brain does, right? We're able to understand so many different modalities. We're able to have knowledge that spans a breadth of things. Is generalizability the future of AI? Well, combining the learnings from CNNs and transformers result in a model that doesn't do what either is good at effectively. But this also begs the question, is Goldilocks not what we want if we really want task precision, right? For medical tasks, do I want a model that's been really specified to the task at hand, or do I want some generalizable model where maybe this is faster to be generalized, or do I want something incredibly specific? And the answer is probably the latter, right? So maybe transformers aren't the best for that, and we can come up with some other architecture that's really specific. And that's all of it. Topology of object detection. We're going to go over this a little fast, but we talked about this a little bit before. On the right is the RCNN that was introduced in the object detection lecture. And in general, for object detection problems, there are two primary approaches. One is generating a kind of region proposal by using either selective search or an RPN, and then classification and regression processes are performed. So once you have these regions that you've proposed as to like maybe what's important, RCNN, fast RCNN, faster RCNN are used as ways to try and get classification by way of object detection. In another approach, however, object detection is completed in a single stage where we don't use some like proposal method, and instead we just have a single neural network model for the object detection process. It's a much faster technique than the first method, but it has relatively worse performance in detecting smaller sized objects, maybe because we're not going through that entire proposal process. DETR is end-to-end object detection with transformers, which is a Facebook paper to use transformers for object detection. The architecture is kind of shown on the right, where we use CNNs for what they're used for best almost, which is feature extraction. And that's called a backbone layer. And then we were able to take these image features and we're able to toss them into something that we hopefully understand well by now, which is an encoder decoder structure in a transformer. And then we get a specific loss function, which performs matching between predicted and ground truth labels. So the goal of this is to kind of generate a set of predictions and then evaluate whether how accurate they were according to our kind of ground truth labels. If we result in something that doesn't correspond to an object in our ground truth label, well then we understand that that should contribute to our loss. This is the general kind of gist of the architecture. As you can see, we have a backbone, which is our CNN feature extractor. We pass it into our transformer encoder, which will implicitly kind of learn positional embeddings themselves. Our decoder feeds into our prediction heads, which are our feed-forward neural networks. And then we run our kind of like bipartite loss to see how accurate this is. This is cool because it combines kind of these two things of CNNs, which are great for feature extraction, their spec locality, all of these great things, with transformers, which are generalizable, which are able to take in long sequences. And so the DETR paper was able to kind of combine these two. Last, we're going to finish off with the segment anything model, which Ryan talked about during our segmentation lecture. But segment anything is a foundation model for segmentation trained on a bunch of images, a bunch of masks. It's composed of 3 primary modules: an image encoder, prompt encoder, and mask decoder. And the inference speed is quite fast. It can generate a segmentation result 15 milliseconds. I believe that Ryan showed a demo during the segmentation lecture, so definitely check that out. It's incredibly impressive. You're able to zoom into a jersey, figure out exactly what the numbers are, and really segment in really fine-grained detail. The general gist of this is that we have an image encoder that we pass it into. We are able to apply a mask. We have a prompt encoder, which takes in some information about specifically what points we're interested in, pass it into a mask decoder, and then each of these are scored. Each of these are considered as valid masks to different degrees. Yeah, it's going to be at the end. Yeah, this is a quick overview of what zero-shot capabilities are. We're able to see how Sam was able to really perform well, even given that it hadn't seen objects like this before. And that's everything. This will be lecture attendance code. I believe this is lecture 15.